my name is Geno and welcome to Discographies, which is a thing that I'm doing. So in this series, I will be going through the discography of a given artist in chronological order, and I'll basically review, critique, and give my opinion on them, trace their development in a way. I'd like to offer up some behind-the-scenes goings-on when I can, which may have influenced the way the music turned out the way it did, make a little story out of it. So to get this started, I'll begin with the progressive rock group, Yes. And as you can see from the poster back here, which is the album artwork from their 1991 album Union, I am quite a big fan, but that doesn't mean that everything that they touch turns to gold. And I'll be going through it all, and I hope that I can encourage you to check them out regardless, whether you know of them or not, and maybe you will look into some works that maybe you have overlooked, or maybe I'll turn you off completely, I don't know. In any case, let's get on with it. So Yes formed in London in 1968, and they're still kicking and touring after 50 years, even though there are no original members remaining, which to some people calls their legitimacy into question. We'll get to that much later. So the original lineup was John Anderson on vocals, Chris Squire on bass, Tony Kaye on organ and piano, Peter Banks on guitar, and Bill Bruford on drums. And now some things of note. John Anderson's vocals are actually quite unique. It sounds like he sings in falsetto, but actually he has a very high, natural tone of voice, and he said that he's an alto tenor. Also, Squire's main bass of choice was a 1964 Rickenbacker RM1999, which he heavily modified himself. I believe he rewired it to have two lineouts, so he could send the bass signal to a regular bass amp, and then send the treble to a guitar amp, and could add effects to it like distortion and stuff like that, without affecting the bass tone of the bass. So if you add fuzz to a regular bass signal, of course it gets fuzzy, but also it loses a lot of the low end. So his crisp and yet also rich bass tone and Anderson's voice really helped set the band apart in their early days. Now Yes were kind of a big deal in the 70s, contributing to the genre of prog rock, but of course they didn't start out that way. So how does their debut album stack up in relation to the rest of their repertoire, and is it worth listening to for its own merits rather than just hearing how the band were in their early days? Well, let's see. Their debut album, the self-titled Yes, was released in the UK in July 1969 and later in the US in October by Atlantic Records. First off, the album cover is rather simple but striking as well. Just Yes in a speech bubble in blackness. Feels exciting and urgent, like, yes, But I guess the Americans thought it was too boring or ambiguous, so for the US release, they used a photo of the band, which is alright, I guess, but now they just kind of look like everyone else at the time. The album was produced by Paul Clay, who by all accounts seemed quite incompetent and not fit for the job. According to some band members, I think he was mostly experienced with musicals, and also the engineers who worked on the album didn't like rock music, and they would tell Peter Banks to turn down his guitar amp. Sounds like a big old mess, and that mess is noticeable throughout the album. So the first track, Beyond and Before, was actually co-written by Chris Squire a couple of years before, when he was with the band Maple Greer's Toy Shop. The lyrics make no sense and is just acid rock jargon of the time, so don't worry about that. It starts off with the bass, playing a single note riff. I thought it was a guitar at first, but his Rickenbacker can really sound deceptively like a guitar in the high register. And that single note riff is repeated a lot throughout the track, and normally I don't have an issue with simple motifs like that. Lots of times it can be pulled off, but here it feels a little lacking. It makes me hunger for more, and it's kind of also annoying even. The drums sound really good in the mix, I think, despite what Bruford says himself. But the guitar sounds out of tune when Banks is laying down some of his solo sections. I don't know, maybe it's just his aggressive style of playing, but to me it just sounds wrong. The vocals have some Beach Boys-esque harmonies. There's a lot of dynamic movement going on in the song, and little linking sections that almost have a classical feel to them. And there were a lot of artists at the time who were experimenting with new formats for songs, new ways to manipulate their music in the studio. You had artists like the Beatles and their Sgt. Pepper's album, the Mothers of Invention and their Freak Out double album, and of course King Crimson, arguably the forerunners of this thing that would eventually become prog rock, but at the time I think it was called progressive pop. Yes, we're no doubt influenced by the likes of King Crimson, but at this moment in time, their adventurousness was noticeable, but also subdued for the most part. Back to the song. The track features a specific arrangement trait that they would use in quite a few songs. Throughout the second verse, they would sing the vocal part in three-part harmony, Anderson, Banks, and Squire, and the band would play a chord in a single strike on the first beat of the bar, and then silent for the rest of it, like something like that, I guess. I can't show a clip of the song because of copyright stuff. The arrangement draws attention to the vocals, and is a surprising shock to the arrangement. There's also a soft section towards the end that gets quieter and quieter before ending with a bang, but not quite ending either, because when the song concludes, there's this 5-second long acoustic guitar picking section that starts up and then stops. I mean, it's possible that they could have been planning on adding on a section to the song at that point, but due to the lack of studio time, they couldn't do it. I don't know. It's just there, but it doesn't go anywhere and leaves me confused. No real reason for that to be there. The next song is I See You, which is actually a cover track by the Byrds from 1966. And yes, really rejiggered the song a lot and added many jazz touches to it. It sounds a lot softer and easygoing compared to the psychedelic and chaotic Byrds cut. Banks said that he didn't like the recording of it because due to time limitations in the studio, there are a few mistakes in his guitar parts. And yeah, I can tell that there definitely are. The original cut is basically just 2 chords over and over again, by the Byrds. But yes made it more complex and, in my opinion, more interesting to listen to. The song goes from soft jazz to hard-biting rock. Bruford's drums are lounge-like for the most of it, really relaxing and jazzy. Bruford has a lot of jazz influences, and you can hear them throughout the album. Lots of vocal harmonies once again, but when John sings lines on his own, the mixing gets really weird, and his vocal track is unnecessarily pushed forward and is just too loud when it doesn't need to be. About 2.5 minutes into it, the song transitions into an extended improvised guitar solo, with Bill Bruford keeping the beat on drums. Super cool beat, led by right cymbal. The solo itself feels kind of lost, with Banks not knowing where to go. He plays these passages that don't gel into each other for the most part. He does feature a quick sample of J.S. Bach's fugue in C minor, BWV 847, which is a nice surprise. I got that reference. Maybe his style of playing is just jazz and I don't get it. Then they've returned to the original motif of the song and ended with a bang, once again. Overall, the track is okay, but I could do without the solo. Next is Yesterday and Today, which is a really soft, dreamy love ballad, featuring acoustic guitar mostly, very quiet bass, piano, and Bruford playing a vibraphone, which really adds to the dreaminess of the track. It sounds like you're listening to raindrops. Before the last chorus, Banks plays a little run on electric guitar, which goes up to a note, and then realizes that it shouldn't be there. Again, I don't see the point of this line being there. The repeated motif at the end on piano sounds really lovely, but the acoustic guitar feels like it forgets how to play. There's a few lost beats, and the guitar fumbles around a bit. There are some bum notes in this one too, and possibly because they didn't have enough time to fix it and retake it. It's really unfortunate that would happen. Maybe it's more common with less established acts. And as a musician and songwriter, I'd hate to think that I would make an album and have it released knowing that it's not as good as it could have been, knowing that it has these mistakes. It can be heartbreaking too. Looking Around starts with a lead from the organ, and it's the first time that you can really hear Tony Kaye playing a prominent part on the Hammond organ in this album. He would usually just play held chords in the background. The chord sequence kind of sounds goofy and a little off-putting, but then it leads right into a driving beat and the song settles into itself. This is probably one of the more together tracks on the entire album. It's got a good structure, the arrangement makes you feel excited and anticipating the next musical section. There's solid, strong vocal harmonies throughout, though it sounds like John Anderson has a few issues reaching some of the high notes. His voice cracks, maybe he should have drank more hot tea before doing that take. The guitar though, I just don't get it. There's some intermittent solos linking sections together and they just don't sound good. Maybe I don't like Banks' soloing style, but apart from the abrasive tone of the guitar, there's an awful lot of flubs. It makes me feel like he doesn't really know how to do solos. I could be wrong. but that's just the way it sounds like on the album, and we have to take the album as it is, unfortunately. There's a chanting section near the close of the song, which I feel is lacking some more harmonies. Personally, I'd want more vocal overdubs and turn the band into a choir for those few bars, and then the song kind of ends. Just ends. I would like it to be a bit longer and have one more repeat of either the verse or the chorus, and maybe even that circus-like organ from the beginning of the song, to bring the song full circle. But not bad. Now, Herald Land is a song about this man's experiences with going to war and then coming back. The name itself doesn't hold much significance, they just came up with it to give the guy in the story a name, though it is the name of a sax player. So, it begins with this incredibly odd 6/8 section led by organ that reminds me of a Lithuanian folk song, and I can say that because I am Lithuanian. Perhaps a German folk song. If you change the organ part to an accordion, I think you'll get the picture. But what really irritates me is the chord progression, which is wholly unsatisfying, and if it were a sentence in a language, you would say that it's grammatically incorrect. God damn it, I'll show you. Okay, so it starts off like this. So that's to a 1 chord. And then they go into the 5 chord, which makes sense. Back to 1. Then there's a 2. So what comes next? You think it's this, right? And then they continue with the rest of the song. But they don't do that. What they do is, they do that. 1 to 5. Then to 1. 2. And after the 2, they go back to 1. Why would you do that? The 2 creates this tension in the musical syntax, and then you just leave it unresolved. It's like if I were to tell you, since it was cold this morning, I got to work at 8:30 and began preparing for class. I think you missed a bit there. You present a problem, but you skip the resolution. I don't know why am I getting so hung up on this one part in particular. But also, just the atmosphere of this section is just downright bizarre, and it's not something that I would expect to have come from the band. Thankfully, it transitions in a rather cool way to the song proper, which sounds quite intense and serious. And what ES learned to do great very early on is that when they have these different thematic sections within a single song, they figure out a creative and cool way to combine them together and make them lead into one another in a way that feels natural. Here there's a tempo and a time signature change to 4/4, and they pulled it off. Top marks. The way that story is told and the way that it's accentuated by the musicians make it sound like it should be a part of a musical, and it's somewhat reminiscent of Peter Gabriel's work with Genesis. The backing vocals in this one sound quite sloppy though, and the mixing is off too. The backing vocals are too much in front a lot of the time, and it just highlights to me that even though they do a lot of vocal harmony, the voices of the bandmates are just mismatched, and Squire and Banks' vocal capabilities aren't as strong as Anderson's, and I think it would have turned out better if it was just multiple layers of John Anderson singing. The story concludes with that weird polka thing from the start, which in retrospect I don't see what its relation is to the story. Unless it's supposed to symbolize Harold's home, his life before the war, when things were better, this one's messy. It's only good in moments, and the atmosphere is unsettled, and the mixing is off once more. But this does introduce another feature commonly used in Yes songs. There is an opening theme, and then it transitions into the bulk of the song, and then it returns back to the original theme. It's like you're at home, but you decide to go on a little adventure, and go outside. Once you're done and tired, you go back home again. It offers closure, musical closure. It's followed by Every Little Thing, which is a cover song of a little-known Beatles track from 1964, which is an inoffensive, light, bouncy love song, though it did have a couple of timpani strikes in the chorus. The Yes cut is drastically different, and they obviously had a lot of fun with this one. It begins with a punch in the face. The band is in full octane mode. Everyone is high energy. The guitar work once again irks me with its bitey, kind of in tune tone. Bruford's drum work is commendably wild and fun to listen to. For a solid 2 minutes, it's just instrumentals, and just as the vocals are about to begin, at around 2 minutes, Peter Banks sneaks in the riff from the Beatles' Day Tripper. Sly Dog You. He leaves these Easter eggs in his solos, and it's kind of fascinating, even though this one was a bit more obvious than the Bach one. The choruses in the song do that thing again, where the vocals carry on while the band only plays on the first beat of the bar. And the Yes take is a lot more adventurous and complex overall than the Beatles' original. But as opposed to the Byrds cover, I can't decide which one I like more. I'm not a big fan of either one, to be honest. I don't think the Beatles track was particularly good, which I think clashes with Yes's efforts to make it as wacky as possible. So this one gets no thanks from me. The penultimate track, Sweetness, is a very laid-back love ballad featuring some skillful, delicate organ work from Kay and clever, sweet lyrics from Anderson. However, for some confounding reason, it was chosen as the leading single from the album, hence making it Yes's first single in their career. And it really doesn't represent what the band was about at all. Anyway, the bass goes on a little trip during the verses, and it doesn't stay steady and fills in the gaps in the vocals with little improvised flourishes, taking on the role that would normally be given to a guitar, maybe. This displays once again that one of the band's greatest strengths was Chris Squire's bass work, and you can hear it throughout the album. The chorus has a good form, and it features a really cool sequence with vocals and bass moving in steps down in harmony. The chorus has good form, and it features a really cool sequence with vocals and bass moving down in steps in harmony, and I could imagine it being part of a hit song from the 60s. Most of the album does in fact sound like the 60s, and you might say, well, of course it does, it was made in the 60s, why wouldn't it sound like it? Well, you do get songs that you might say are ahead of their time and timeless, and still sound as fresh today as the day they were recorded, because they didn't use as many compositional cliches of the time, or they didn't confine themselves to an instrumentation that was commonplace when they made the song. I'd say that a lot of future Yes songs do fall into this category of timelessness, but I don't want to compare their upcoming work too much with their debut album. I'll return to this point a bit later. Finally, we have Survival. It starts off with a riff played on bass, with Squire also utilizing a wah pedal too, and it leads into a really cool groove led by repeating organ motif. It sounds powerful and mature, and I'd say it wouldn't sound too out of place at all in one of the band's later albums in the 70s. Then that section fades away into a softer, jazzier mood where the majority of the song resides. You can still hear that organ motif showing up in the choruses throughout, which helps to connect those separate sections, I think. The lyrics are about a bird egg that has to hatch on its own because its mother was shot by a hunter or something. The message is very environmentalist, and it's a theme that returns many times throughout Yes's career. The drums on this track sound pretty muddled, whereas for most of the rest of the album, they were mixed pretty solid. That's interesting and distracting. The backing harmonies on this one sound lost and weak, as if it was a vocal range that the musicians weren't used to, and it distracts from an otherwise powerful hook in the chorus. The mixing, once again, is off balance. It's a recurring theme that the backing vocals are too loud throughout the album. And at the end, just like in Herald Land, the faster organ-led section from the beginning makes its return to conclude the song, and its ending is really satisfying. The organ, bass, and guitar take turns to call at each other using that run-up motif from the organ. And the panning and the reverb really creates this distance between the instruments. Maybe it's supposed to represent Byrds' song, like birds talking to each other, as a callback to the message of the song. It's kind of a shame that whenever they played anything from their first album in their later years, they always seem to go with every little thing, when it should have been Looking Around or Survival, which really sounds like what Yes later turned into. Okay, so to wrap things up, my personal opinions are quite similar to what a lot of the critics at the time said about the album, is that it's a band with potential, and you can hear the potential for greater things all throughout, though the compositions are sometimes lacking in substance, or they introduce ideas which aren't realized in full. And that's a major point to take away from this album, is that it's like a time capsule of a group of young, ambitious musicians who are still honing their craft. They had big ideas that they were still improving upon. And Yes's earliest albums are, for lack of a better word, progression. Over time, they progressed and grew in maturity and complexity, and competence in the music they made. The first album suffered greatly from in-studio disputes and complications too. Many times the mix was distractingly bad, and due to their limited time to record the tracks, there's a whole bunch of bum notes and sloppy performances, which creates a feeling that the group is more incompetent than they actually are. But those are the breaks, and this is the album that started it all. So given all things into account, I'm gonna rate it a 5.5 out of 10. Not super crazy about a lot of the songs, and of course the production is subpar. The album did get some good words from reviewers, but it didn't get noticed by the wider public. So they went on tour, they performed on TV too, and soon got to work on a follow-up album, which I will address in the next video on Wednesday. So that's it for now. Like and subscribe for more original music and reviews. Special thanks to my patrons, and if you're interested in contributing, check out the links below for my Patreon and original music. Thanks again. See you around. Goddamn helicopter.